My wife was driving home like she did every other day, following the rules, staying calm, and not bothering anyone, when a car without real police markings suddenly pulled in behind her and forced her to pull over for what they called a routine stop, even though she had done nothing wrong. Two men stepped out and said they were HOA enforcement, talking like they had real power, telling her she was in trouble for a community violation, and demanding her license as if they were real cops. She tried to stay calm and asked what rules she had broken, but they talked over her, raised their voices, and acted like their rules mattered more than the law and more than her safety. People nearby started watching. Phones came out, and everyone could feel that something about the stop was not right, especially when the men laughed and said she had no choice but to obey them. What they did not know was this: the woman they had stopped on the side of the road was my wife, and I am the police chief. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you are watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. My wife was driving home like she did every other day, following the speed limit, staying in her lane, and thinking about nothing more than getting home safely, when a car she did not recognize suddenly appeared behind her and began following too closely for comfort. At first she told herself it was nothing, because people drive badly all the time and she did not want to assume the worst. Then the car stayed close. It did not pass. It did not back off. It stayed right there, close enough that she could see the driver clearly in her rearview mirror. A few seconds later, unfamiliar lights began flashing, lights that looked official at first glance but did not feel right the longer she looked at them. Her heart rate increased not because she had done anything wrong, but because something about the situation felt off. She checked her speed again. She checked her mirrors. She checked the road signs. She was not speeding. She was not swerving. She had not broken any rule. Still, the car behind her kept flashing the lights, signaling for her to pull over. She slowed down carefully and pulled to the side of the road in a well-lit area where other people were nearby because instinct told her that safety mattered more than convenience. The car stopped behind her, but instead of a marked police vehicle, she saw an ordinary car with no official logos, no department name, and no clear identification. That was the first moment she felt real concern. Two men stepped out of the car and neither one looked like a real police officer. Their clothes were similar to uniforms, but not quite right. Their badges were shiny but unfamiliar. Their confidence felt forced instead of earned. They walked toward her car with wide steps and loud voices, already talking before they even reached her window. One of them told her this was a routine stop, and said she was being pulled over for a community violation. My wife calmly asked what violation she had committed. Instead of answering, the man repeated himself louder, as if volume could replace authority. The second man stood closer than necessary, positioning himself near her door in a way that made her uncomfortable. They demanded her license and registration without explaining anything. She kept her hands visible and spoke slowly, asking again what rules she had broken and why HOA enforcement was stopping her on a public road. The men exchanged looks and smirked, clearly annoyed that she was asking questions instead of simply obeying. One of them said HOA rules applied to everyone and that arguing would only make things worse. She could feel the pressure building, not just from their words, but from their body language and the way they tried to surround her car. People nearby began to notice what was happening. A man walking his dog slowed down and stopped. A woman standing outside a nearby house crossed her arms and stared. Phones came out. The men noticed the attention and became louder, trying to sound more official, more powerful, and more in control than they actually were. They told my wife she needed to step out of the car and stop asking questions. She refused calmly and said she wanted a real police officer present. That was when their tone changed. Their smiles disappeared. Their voices sharpened. One of them said she did not get to make demands and that they could detain her if they wanted. My wife felt the danger clearly now, not because they had weapons, but because they were pretending to have authority they did not legally possess. She understood how quickly situations like this could turn bad when people played roles they were not trained for. Neighbors whispered to each other. More phones recorded. Someone asked out loud if these men were real cops. The HOA men ignored the question. They said rules mattered more than feelings. They said compliance was mandatory. My wife stayed calm even though the situation was tense because panic would only give them what they wanted. What they did not know in that moment was this: the woman sitting in that driver's seat being talked down to and pressured on the side of the road was not powerless. She was my wife, and I am the police chief. The two old men stood beside my wife's car longer than necessary, blocking her door and her view, acting as if the road belonged to them simply because they decided it did. They kept repeating the same words, saying this was a routine stop and that HOA enforcement had the right to question her, even though they could not explain where that right came from or why it applied on a public street. One of the men tapped on her window again and again, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to feel threatening, as if he wanted to remind her that he was there and not going anywhere. My wife rolled the window down only a few inches and asked, in a calm and steady voice, what community rules she had violated and why HOA employees were stopping her instead of real police officers. The man answered without really answering, using vague words and long sentences that sounded official but meant nothing. He said the HOA had authority to enforce rules for the safety of the neighborhood, even though the neighborhood was several streets away and the road they were standing on did not belong to the HOA at all. The second man stood back with his arms crossed, watching her closely, trying to look intimidating, trying to look like someone with power. Their confidence was loud, but their knowledge was thin. They spoke over her whenever she asked a question, cutting her off mid-sentence, raising their voices as if that would stop her from thinking clearly. My wife noticed the small details immediately, because training teaches you to notice what does not fit. Their badges were clipped on crooked. Their radios were cheap and silent. Their movements were stiff and unsure. Real officers do not act this way. They do not crowd a driver without reason. They do not avoid clear answers. They do not rely on threats instead of facts. The HOA men demanded her license again, louder this time, and one of them said refusing would only make things worse for her. She asked calmly if she was being detained or free to leave. The question caught them off guard. They looked at each other, clearly not expecting someone to challenge them in a calm and untrolled way. After a short pause, one of them said she was being detained for now, even though he could not explain why. That was the moment their act slipped. Detaining someone is not a casual choice. It is not a word you throw around to scare people. Neighbors nearby began whispering more openly now, because it was clear something was wrong. A man across the street shook his head and said this did not look legal. A woman near the sidewalk raised her phone higher to get a better view. The HOA men noticed the attention and grew defensive. They turned toward the small crowd and told everyone to mind their own business, saying this was HOA enforcement and not a police matter. That only made people more suspicious. My wife stayed inside the car, her hands visible on the steering wheel, her voice steady, her posture calm. She did not raise her voice. She did not insult them. She did not threaten them. She simply continued asking clear questions they could not answer. One of the men stepped closer to her door and told her to step out of the vehicle immediately. She refused and asked again for a real police officer. The man laughed and said she did not get to decide how this worked. That laugh told everyone watching exactly what kind of people they were. They were not interested in safety. They were not interested in rules. They were interested in control. Phones continued recording. Someone quietly called 911. The HOA men started to sense that the situation was slipping out of their control, and instead of backing down, they doubled down. They talked faster. They spoke louder. They made bigger claims. They said they could tow her car. They said they could fine her on the spot. They said resisting would lead to arrest. Every word they spoke pushed them deeper into trouble. My wife watched them carefully, knowing that people like this often make the biggest mistakes when they feel exposed. She remained still, calm, and patient, allowing them to reveal exactly who they were and what they were doing wrong. The crowd grew slightly larger, but no one stepped in, because everyone understood that this was already being documented and that interference could make things worse. The HOA men were playing police, but they did not understand the weight of what they were pretending to be. Authority is not a costume. Power is not something you borrow. And pretending to be law enforcement, even for a few minutes, is not a small mistake. It is a serious line to cross. The men had crossed it without even realizing how far they had gone, and they still had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that every move they made was being judged, remembered, and recorded. They believed they were in control. They were wrong. And the longer they kept playing police without authority, the worse it was going to get for them. At first, only one person stopped to watch, a man walking his dog who slowed his steps and frowned as he looked from the unmarked car to the two men standing too close to my wife's window. He did not say anything right away, but he did not walk away either, because something about the scene felt wrong in a way that was hard to ignore. Then another person noticed. A woman watering her plants across the street paused, lowered the hose, and stared, trying to understand why a regular-looking car was stopped on the side of the road with two men acting like police officers. She pulled out her phone, not to record at first, but to look more closely, to zoom in, to check for markings that should have been there but were not. Within minutes, the quiet street no longer felt empty. People slowed their cars as they passed. Some stopped at the corner. Others stood on their porches pretending to check messages while watching everything unfold. The air changed. The HOA men noticed it too, even if they pretended not to. They began to stand straighter, speak louder, and use bigger gestures as if putting on a show for an audience they did not want but could not avoid. One of them turned slightly so his badge was more visible, holding his chest forward like that alone would prove something. My wife noticed how their behavior shifted the moment they realized they were being watched. Before, they were focused only on her. Now they were focused on how they looked. Phones came out slowly at first, then more openly. A teenager across the street lifted his phone and hit record without hiding it. A man leaned against his truck and filmed if. ROM waist level. No one shouted, no one interfered, but the silence itself felt heavy because everyone understood that this was no longer a private moment. The HOA men began speaking in sharper tones, using words like detention and non-compliance louder than necessary, hoping the language alone would make them sound legitimate. They repeated the phrase routine stop again and again, even though no one believed it anymore. Someone in the crowd finally spoke. They asked, calmly but clearly, if these men were real police officers. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. One of the HOA men ignored it completely, pretending not to hear, while the other snapped that this was HOA business and that everyone needed to back away. That response only raised more doubt. People exchanged looks. Heads shook slightly. A woman whispered that OA could not pull people over on public roads. Another person nodded and said this felt illegal. My wife stayed quiet, listening, watching, and keeping her hands steady on the steering wheel. She could feel the pressure building, not just from the men but from the moment itself, because situations like this can turn fast when pride and fear collide. The HOA men tried to regain control by talking faster, interrupting anyone who spoke, and stepping wider, as if their physical presence could push the crowd back. It did not work. The more they tried to dominate the scene, the more uncomfortable everyone became. Someone farther back immediately called 911, explaining that there appeared to be men impersonating police officers and stopping a driver without a marked vehicle. The HOA men did not know the call had been made, but they could sense the shift. Their voices cracked slightly. Their smiles disappeared completely. One of them told my wife again to step out of the car, this time pointing at the ground as if drawing a line she was expected to cross. She refused calmly and said she would remain inside until a real officer arrived. The word real landed harder than anything else that had been said. The crowd reacted to it immediately. Several people nodded. Someone said exactly under their breath. The HOA men grew angry now. Not loud angry, but tight angry, the kind that shows in clenched jaws and stiff movements. They did not like being questioned. They did not like being watched. They were used to people backing down, not standing still. My wife could see that they were losing confidence, even as they tried to hide it. Authority, when it is fake, does not hold up well under attention. It cracks. The crowd continued to grow slowly, not rushing in, but not leaving either. Cars parked along the street. People stood at a distance, careful not to interfere but unwilling to look away. Everyone understood that what they were seeing mattered. This was no longer just about one driver and two men. It was about power being tested in public. The HOA men were now performing more than enforcing, trying to convince St. Rangers that they were allowed to do what they were doing. Every sentence they spoke was being recorded. Every mistake was being saved. My wife remained calm because she knew something they did not. She knew that the truth does not need volume. It only needs time. The men tried one last time to scare her by threatening fines, towing, and further action, but the words fell flat now that the crowd had seen too much. No one believed them anymore. The street was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes right before something changes. The HOA men stood there, trapped by their own choices, surrounded not by force but by witnesses. They had wanted control. Instead, they had an audience. And they still had no idea just how badly that was about to work against them. The moment one of the HOA men stepped closer to my wife's car, the situation changed in a way that everyone watching could feel, even if they could not yet explain it. He closed the distance without being invited. standing so close to her door that his shadow fell across the window, blocking part of her view of the street. His voice was calm but not friendly, and he told her again that she needed to step out of the vehicle immediately. There was no explanation. There was no legal reason given. There was only an order. My wife took a slow breath and calmly told him she would not exit the car without a real police officer present. She did not raise her voice. She did not insult him. She did not argue. She simply stated a boundary. That boundary made him angry. The man's jaw tightened, and his face changed in a way that showed he was no longer pretending this was routine. He told her that refusing an order would have consequences. She asked him again if she was being detained and under what authority. He did not answer the question. Instead, he reached toward the door handle. That single movement caused a reaction from everyone watching. A woman in the crowd gasped quietly. Someone said, "Hey." Under their breath, several phones lifted higher at the exact same time. The man did not pull the handle yet, but his hand hovered there, close enough to send a clear message. That was the moment he crossed the line. Up until then, he had been pretending. Now he was threatening physical control. The second HOA man stepped closer as well, positioning himself behind the first, blocking the space between the car and the road. They were no longer acting like rule enforcers. They were acting like people who believed they could take whatever they wanted. My wife stayed perfectly still. Her hands remained on the steering wheel. Her posture stayed calm. She knew that sudden movement could be used against her, and she knew that fear was exactly what they wanted. The man told her that if she did not comply, he would remove her from the vehicle himself. There was no hesitation in his voice. That sentence alone changed everything. A neighbor finally spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, saying that these men were not police and had no right to touch her. Another person said someone had already called 911. The HOA men reacted badly to that information. One of them snapped at the crowd, telling everyone to back away and stop recording. That only made more people raise their phones. The man at the door knocked hard on the window now, not tapping, but striking it with his knuckles in a way that made the sound echo down the street. My wife did not flinch. She looked straight ahead and Elimli told him to step away from the vehicle. He laughed, but it was not a confident laugh. It was sharp and forced, the sound of someone trying to convince himself he was still in control. He said HOA enforcement had the right to detain residents and that she was making things harder for herself. That was a lie, and everyone watching knew it. The second man began pacing slightly, running his hand over his belt, even though there was nothing there that gave him any real authority. He kept looking around, noticing the number of people watching had grown. Cars were now stopped at both ends of the street. People stood on sidewalks and driveways. This was no longer a private confrontation. This was a public mistake. My wife repeated her request for a real police officer, her voice steady and clear. The first man leaned closer and told her she did not get to decide what happened next. That sentence was the clearest sign of all. This was never about rules. It was about control. Someone in the crowd shouted that he needed to step back. Another person told him to keep his hands off the car. The HOA men were visibly shaken now, not by fear, but by the realization that they were losing the narrative. They were no longer the ones giving orders. They were the ones being questioned. The man at the door finally stepped back half a step, not because he wanted to, but because he realized too many people were watching to continue. That half step did not fix what he had already done. The damage was already there. Threatening to remove a driver from a car without authority is not a small mistake. It is a serious offense. My wife could see the cracks forming in their behavior. They spoke less clearly now. They contradicted each other. One said she was detained, the other said she was not. They could not even agree on their own story. The crowd noticed. Whispers turned into quiet statements of fact. People said this was illegal. People said these men were impersonating officers. The HOA men tried to regain control by threatening fines and towing again, but the words sounded empty now. No one believed them anymore. My wife stayed calm because she understood something important. When people cross a line like this, they often panic when they realize there is no way back. The men had crossed that line in front of witnesses, cameras, and time. They could not undo it. They could only make it worse or wait for the truth to arrive. The street grew quiet again, not peaceful, but tense, like everyone was holding their breath at once. The HOA men stood there, no longer confident, no longer sure, surrounded by eyes and lenses they could not escape. They had wanted to show power. Instead, they had exposed themselves, and although they did not know it yet, the consequences of crossing that line were already on the way. The first sign that things were about to change was not a siren or flashing lights, but a shift in the way the HOA men began to move and speak. Their voices dropped slightly. Their sentences became shorter. They looked down the street more often now, checking both directions, no longer focused only on my wife. The crowd noticed it too. People stopped whispering and started watching the road because everyone understood that once a situation like this reaches a certain point, it does not end quietly. A few minutes passed and then another car pulled up slowly at the far end of the street. It was not an HOA vehicle. It was not unmarked. It was a real police cruiser. The moment it came into view, everything changed. The HOA men froze for half a second, just long enough for anyone paying attention to see the panic flash across their faces. One of them took a small step back from my wife's car, as if distance alone could undo what he had already done. The other cleared his throat and tried to straighten his posture, adjusting his shirt and touching his badge as if that would suddenly make it real. The cruiser pulled closer and stopped behind the unmarked car. A uniformed officer stepped out calmly, not rushing, not shouting, but clearly in control of the scene, the moment his boots touched the pavement. He took one look at the crowd, the phones, the positioning of the vehicles, and the two men standing where they should not have been standing. He did not need anyone to explain that something was wrong. He walked toward my wife's car first, not the HOA men, and asked if she was okay. She nodded and told him she was fine, her voice steady, her and still visible. That simple exchange said everything the crowd needed to hear. The officer then turned to the HOA men and asked them to step away from the vehicle. This time, they did not argue. They moved back immediately. The officer asked them who they were and why they had stopped a driver on a public road. One of the men began speaking quickly, stumbling over his words, trying to explain that this was HOA enforcement and that they were just doing their job. The officer listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When the man finished, the officer asked a single question. He asked under what legal authority they believed they had to conduct a traffic stop. Neither man answered right away. They looked at each other, hoping the other would speak first. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. The crowd leaned in slightly, sensing that this was the moment everything they had suspected was being confirmed. The officer asked again, more clearly this time, and reminded them that impersonating law enforcement was a serious offense. That word, impersonating, landed hard. One of the HOA men tried to laugh it off and said it was all a misunderstanding. The officer did not smile. He asked for identification. They handed it over slowly, their hands shaking just enough to be noticed. While the officer reviewed their information, another police unit arrived, followed shortly by a third. The street now held real authority, not borrowed confidence. Nay. JHBORs watched silently as the HOA men were separated and questioned individually. Their stories did not match. One claimed they were instructed to stop vehicles. The other claimed they were only meant to observe. Every contradiction made their situation worse. My wife was asked to step out of her car, not as a suspect but as a witness. She did so calmly and spoke with the officers quietly, answering questions clearly and directly. The officer listening to her grew more serious with every sentence. At one point he nodded and stepped away to make a call. That call did not take long. When he returned, his tone toward the HOA men changed completely. He informed them they were being detained for questioning related to unlawful detention and impersonation of law enforcement. The crowd reacted with a quiet murmur. No one cheered. No one clapped. There was only the sound of truth settling into place. One of the HOA men tried to protest, saying they did not know they were breaking the law. The officer responded calmly that not knowing the law did not excuse violating it. As the men were escorted away from my wife's car, one of them finally looked at her closely, really looked at her, as if trying to understand why she had never panicked. It was in that moment that the final piece fell into place for them. One of the officers addressed my wife with a level of respect that went beyond routine. He acknowledged her training. He acknowledged her composure. The realization hit the HOA me. And like a sudden drop, the woman they had tried to intimidate was not helpless. She was not unprepared. She was connected to real authority in a way they had never imagined. When my name was mentioned quietly between officers, the color drained from their faces. They finally understood what they had done and who they had done it to. The crowd watched as the men were formally detained, their fake confidence completely gone. Phones continued recording, not out of anger but out of disbelief that something so reckless had happened in plain sight. My wife was thanked for her patience and professionalism. She returned to her car calmly, as if the weight of the moment had not just passed through the street. The officers stayed behind to speak with witnesses and collect video evidence, because this was no longer just a warning or a mistake. This was a case. As the police cars pulled away with the HOA men in the back, the street slowly returned to normal. People went back to their homes. Engines started, phones lowered, but the feeling did not disappear. Everyone who witnessed it understood they had seen something important. They had seen what happens when people pretend to have power they do not deserve. They had seen how quickly that lie falls apart when the truth arrives. And the HOA men had learned a lesson they would never forget. You cannot fake authority. You cannot borrow the law. And you cannot bully your way past the truth. The street looked normal again once the police cars were gone. But nothing about what had happened felt small or forgettable. Neighbors stood outside longer than usual, talking quietly to each other, replaying the moment in their heads, because everyone understood they had just witnessed something serious. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an accident. It was a choice. The HOA men had chosen to act like police officers. They had chosen to stop a driver on a public road. They had chosen to threaten, intimidate, and detain someone without legal authority. Those choices followed them once the scene ended. At the station, the reality set in fast. Their fake confidence disappeared the moment they were separated, questioned, and informed of the charges they were facing. Impersonating law enforcement is not a small mistake. Unlawful detention is not a warning-level offense. The paperwork was long. The evidence was clear. Multiple witness statements were taken. Several videos were submitted from different angles. Every command they gave, every threat they made, every step they took too far, it was all recorded. Their stories did not help them. They contradicted each other again and again, trying to minimize their actions, trying to say they were just following HOA instructions. But instructions do not override the law. The HOA board was contacted and questioned, and the answers they gave only made things worse. No one had the authority to stop vehicles. No one had permission to act as police. The men had gone far beyond and the HOA was allowed to do. As the investigation continued, more complaints surfaced. Other residents came forward. Other stories were told. People spoke about being threatened with fines. People spoke about being followed. People spoke about intimidation that had gone unchallenged until now. What happened to my wife was not the first time these men abused their position. It was just the first time they did it in front of cameras, witnesses, and real law enforcement. The HOA suspended the men immediately, but that did not protect them from criminal consequences. Suspension does not erase crimes. Charges were filed. Court dates were set. The reality of what they had done finally settled in when they realized this would not disappear quietly. Their names were attached to reports. Their actions were attached to evidence. They were no longer in control of the story. My wife returned home that night, safe, calm, and quiet. But the weight of the day did not disappear right away. Situations like that stay with you, even when you handle them correctly. We talked about it slowly, not with anger, but with clarity, because the truth was simple. Power without limits always becomes abuse. The community changed after that day. HOA rules were rewritten. Authority lines were clarified. Residents became more aware of their rights and less afraid to question behavior that did not feel right. People learned that confidence does not equal authority. And the HOA learned that pretending to be power can destroy trust faster than anything else. The men who thought they could act like cops learned the hardest lesson of all. You cannot borrow a badge, you cannot fake the law, and you cannot intimidate your way out of accountability. The law does not bend for ego. It does not bend for uniforms without meaning. It bends only toward truth. That day ended without violence. It ended without chaos. But it ended with consequences. Because when people cross lines they do not have the right to cross, the law eventually answers, and that is why the good guys always win.